I've been writing this account in compact standard rather than Veldrith because my own language has already begun to smooth over the sharpest edges of what happened, and I want the record accurate. In Veldrith, there are words that carry entire structures of obligation and shame inside them, and when I write in those words, the events arrange themselves into a kind of ancient grammar that makes what occurred seem inevitable, as though it followed a recognized shape, a story the language already knew how to tell. It didn't. Nothing about what happened on Sethavar Reach followed any shape I had ever been shown. That is why I am writing in a borrowed tongue, using words that have no weight of clan history in them, so that the account stays honest, and the man who is at the center of it receives an honest account rather than a shaped one. His name is Davin Kale. He was a Union Frontier infantry officer for 22 years before he took the liaison posting, and if you ask him about those 22 years, he will give you a number of words and then stop, the way a man does when the words he has are accurate but insufficient. He is 48 years old. His hair is dark gone silver at the temples. There is a scar that runs from the left side of his jaw to just below his ear, pale and old. His eyes are gray, and when he looks at you fully, not as an assessment, not with the measuring quality that most humans in authority positions use when they look at someone they don't know. He simply looks. I did not know in the early weeks what to do with that. I should explain what I was before I explain what I became, because the void naming is not something most non-Veldrith understand. They hear exiled, and they map their own meanings onto it. It is not exile. Exile is a place you go. There is still a you to go there. A void naming is a cancellation of personhood within the Veldrith social and legal architecture. When the clan elder speaks the phrase over you and the bonding circle witnesses sign the register, you cease to exist as a member of the Veldrith community in any functional sense. Every Veldrith who acknowledges you after the void naming incurs a compact penalty. Every Veldrith who conducts any commerce with you forfeits their standing in the trade network. The void naming does not prevent you from physically existing. You continue to breathe, to require food, to occupy space. It simply removes the social and legal infrastructure that makes that existence legible to the community you were born into. I was 312 days into my void naming when Davin Kale arrived on Sethavar Reach. My name, before the void naming, was Thessaravel on Sethvar, third daughter of the Sethvar bonding house, ranked in the second tier of the Veldrith succession framework. My bonding circle had been formally constituted 2 years prior, 7 individuals selected by the house elders according to the compatibility matrix, each of them having passed the Veldrith verification process, each of them having signed the preliminary compact. What happened at the bonding ceremony itself I will not recount in full, because the specifics are not the point, and because they are mine to keep. What is relevant is that 3 of the 7 withdrew before the circle closed. 3 withdrawals within a single ceremony is, under Veldrith compact law, grounds for declaring the bonding candidate incomplete. A finding that triggers a void naming review, and a review before Elder Orvith San Vale, who had been trying to consolidate the Sethvar House's trade rights into his own branch's control for 11 years, will produce one outcome and one outcome only. The void naming was issued 14 days after the ceremony. I was given 72 hours to vacate the Sethvar compound. I took what I could carry. I ended up on Sethavar Reach because it was distant, and because it was a mixed species way station, which meant that there were non-Veldrith communities in whose company I could exist without the void naming penalty applying to them. The humans in the market did not know what a void naming was. The Ashkivar traders in the eastern quarter did not care. The Veldrith residents of the way station, there were 11 of them, running 3 separate trade operations, knew exactly what I was, and they managed it the way the Veldrith manage all unpleasant social facts, by finding the precise angle of vision that allowed them to look past me without appearing to look away. It is a skill my people develop early. We are very good at making erasure look like inattention. Sethavar Reach itself was not a beautiful place, in the conventional sense. The way station had been built in stages over several decades by whoever found a commercial reason to build, which meant the architecture was a patchwork of material and intent, modular compact tissue transit housing, alongside older stone and composite merchant buildings, alongside the recent prefab additions of the garrison complex. The central market ran in a covered arcade between two rows of mixed-species storefronts, and in the morning it smelled of dried resins and Veldrith grain products and the sharp chemical undertone of Ashkavar cooking oil. The light was good in the mornings, when the sun came over the eastern ridge and struck the arcade at a low angle that turned the dust motes amber. By midday it was white and flat and the shadows disappeared, and the market's commercial business tended to slow in the heat, and most transactions of any complexity happened in the cooler hours of early morning and late afternoon. I arrived in the early dry season. The dust was considerable. I had 47 compact credits, 1 bag, and the specific kind of composure that is not calm but is calm-adjacent. The composure of a person who has no immediate next step and is therefore simply present, waiting for the present to resolve into something more directed. Threshvalen's store was near the western end of the arcade, and I stopped there because she had a notice in the window for part-time inventory help, and the notice was written in 3 languages, which I took as evidence that she was not particular about species, and not being particular about species was what I needed. She looked at me for a moment when I came in. She did not perform the geometry of inattention. She looked at me directly and said, in adequate compact standard, "You know inventory work." I said that I did. She said, "You start tomorrow, early morning, 6 hours." She told me the rate and she told me where to find the supply annex cot. She asked no other questions. I have thought about that a great deal since. The decision not to ask questions, the reading of the situation that made questions unnecessary. Threshvalen was not an uncurious woman. She simply understood that some information is better received in its own time, and that a person who has just walked across a frontier way station carrying everything she owns is not in a position to give reliable answers to the most important questions, and that the relevant thing to establish was whether the work could be done. The work could be done. I did it well, and Threshvalen noticed that I did it well, and the noticing was itself a small form of recognition that I received with the careful gratitude of someone who has learned not to spend resources that might need to last. I had a cot in the supply annex behind a compact registered general goods store. It was sufficient. I had reduced my requirements considerably by that point. You learn, when the social architecture of your existence has been removed, that you require much less than you thought. The cot, the compact credit, the inventory work which gave me hours of forward structure, a list of tasks, the small competence of knowing where each bin was and what it held. I was not unhappy in any acute sense. I had gone somewhere quieter than unhappy. I had gone to a place that did not have a name in compact standard, and that in Veldrith is called Orvith Sethvan, the condition of a person who has ceased to expect anything from the world and has found, in that cessation, a kind of gray stability. Davin Kale arrived on the 3rd morning of the 7th month of my time on Sethavar Reach. The Union garrison had received a new liaison officer. The previous one, a young woman named Sareth, had completed her posting rotation, and the new appointment had been logged in the way station's administrative feed 2 weeks prior. I had noted it the way I noted all administrative changes, as a fact, without weight. He came into the market on his 2nd morning. The garrison officers generally followed a route that took them through the central market, the eastern quarter, and the northern service bays. A visibility walk, the garrison called it, designed to maintain presence and address any compact disputes before they escalated. I was at Threshvalen's outer display when he came through the central market, and I was restacking a row of Veldrith imported dried grain pods on the display shelf, and I was watching my hands because watching my hands was one of the ways I kept the gray stability operational, because my hands were doing something, and things that are doing something are proof of continued existence. He stopped at the display. Not at me, at the display, at the dried grain pods, the way a man stops when he is genuinely curious about something and has not yet decided whether to act on that curiosity. He looked at the pods for a moment. Then he looked at me. I looked back, because not looking back would have been a statement I was not yet ready to make. He said in compact standard, "Good morning." 2 words, not remarkable words. The kind of words that fall out of basic social protocol automatically, that mean nothing in excess of their function. But he said them to me, which was remarkable, because in 312 days only 2 people had addressed me by choice in compact standard Thresh-Valen, who employed me, and a human child of perhaps 6 years who had asked me what my hair was made of. Everyone else had managed the geometry of the market in such a way that no exchange was required. I said, "Good morning." It came out somewhat more precisely than I intended, as though my voice had been waiting in reserve and was perhaps slightly startled to be called upon. He looked at the grain pods again. He said, "These are Veldrith import." I said that they were. I explained, because my compact standard had become quite good by that point, and because explaining things was one of my remaining pleasures, that the pods were from the temperate belt of the Veldrith home system's second agricultural moon, that they were dried rather than processed, which meant the flavor was close to the original, and that most non-Veldrith found them sweeter than they expected. He listened to this without the expression of mild patient endurance that I had learned to recognize in listeners who did not actually want the information they had prompted. He listened the way someone listens when they are actually receiving the words rather than waiting for them to stop. Then he said, "I'll try 3, and he paid for 3, and he said, "Thank you," and he went on his way. That was the first morning. He came back the next day, not to buy anything, but because the route took him past the display again, and because he apparently found it natural to say, "How are you this morning?" and wait for an actual answer. I gave him one. I said that I was well, and that the inventory was in better order than it had been the previous day because Thresh-Valen had taken delivery of 2 new consignments, and I had spent the previous afternoon reorganizing the back annex to accommodate them. He said that reorganizing a storage space was one of those tasks that was deeply satisfying in the moment and required effort to begin, which was true, and we agreed on this, and he went on his way. I want to be precise about what these interactions were, because I have seen the account of those early weeks shaped in the retelling by Thresh-Valen, who is warm and generous and who has a storyteller's instinct for meaning, into something more charged than it was. It was not charged. It was quiet. It was 2 people exchanging words in the morning. The significance, such as it was, lay entirely in the fact that it was happening at all, that a day could contain a person who said "good morning" to me and waited to hear my answer, that this could be a reliable feature of a morning rather than a random event. I was not yet capable of reading more into it than that. The Orvith-Sethvan condition is not quickly reversed. You can know, intellectually, that someone is being kind without being able to receive the kindness all the way down. The knowing is the first stage. The receiving takes longer. Elder Orvith Sanvale arrived on Sethavar Reach in the 5th week of Davin Kale's posting. He came as part of a trade inspection delegation, 3 elders, 7 trade representatives, a legal clerk, 2 compact officers, and the delegation was important to the way station because the Veldrith trade network through Sethavar Reach represented approximately 40% of the transit commerce that kept the garrison supply lines operational. I knew he was coming because the way station administrative feed listed the delegation's arrival date, and because I knew his name the way you know the name of the person who signed the order that removed you from the world. I considered leaving the market for the duration of the delegation's visit. I had 3 days' warning. I could have arranged with Thresh-Valen to work in the back annex and on the supply routes rather than the outer display. I could have made myself effectively invisible, which I had become quite practiced at. I chose not to, and I am still examining that choice to understand it. My best account of it is this. The Orvith-Sethvan condition had given me a kind of stripped-down stubbornness that was not courage and was not defiance, but was something more like a refusal to let the void naming govern my geography as well as my social standing. He had already taken my name. He had already taken my house. He did not get to take the market as well. The delegation arrived on a bright morning. Sethavarich's sun was strong at that hour, and the market was fully active, and they came through the central arcade as delegations always did, with the elder leading and the trade representatives arranged behind him in the careful hierarchical spacing the Veldrith used to signal relative importance. I was at the outer display. I watched Orvith Sonvale's eyes find me, and then slide past in the precise way that the void naming requires. I watched the 7 trade representatives perform the same movement, one after another, each of them having learned it, each of them doing it with the smooth fluency of long practice. Davin Kale came through the market 8 minutes later. He came from the garrison direction in his liaison officer's uniform, with a compact tissue reader tucked under his arm and the same unhurried pace he always had. He was not part of the delegation. He was doing his morning route. He came to the display. He said, "Good morning, Thessaravil." He had begun using my name in the 2nd week. I had told it to him myself, he had asked, which no one had asked in a long time, and he had used it each morning since, with the slightly careful pronunciation of a man who was respectful of the sounds he wasn't certain about. I had corrected him once, gently, on the middle syllable. He had thanked me and corrected it and not made an event of it. He said, "Good morning," and he said my name, and in the same breath he was aware of the delegation. I watched him clock them, the swift professional assessment of a man who has spent 22 years reading rooms, and his posture did not change, and his expression did not change, and he stood where he was. Orvith Sonvale stopped walking. He was perhaps 6 meters away. He turned and he looked at the human liaison officer standing at Threshvalen's outer display, talking to a void-named individual, and the look on his face was not outrage, and it was not anger. It was the look of a man who has found an administrative inconvenience that he is confident he knows how to resolve. He crossed the distance in the measured way of a man who does not hurry because hurrying implies urgency and urgency implies opposition, and he did not consider this a matter requiring opposition. He addressed Davin Kale. He did not address me. In the Veldrith social architecture, addressing me would have been an acknowledgement. He said in compact standard, "Liaison officer." His compact standard was excellent. The Veldrith elders who run trade delegations invest heavily in language fluency. I believe there may be a misunderstanding regarding the individual at this display. I would be glad to clarify the situation for you at your convenience. Davin Kale looked at him, that full, complete look. He said, "Good morning, Elder. I'm familiar with the situation." There was a pause. Orvith Sonvale said, "Then you'll understand that the Veldrith Compact governing waystation commerce includes provisions regarding interaction with void-named individuals. Those provisions are enforceable within any registered trading zone." Davin Kale said, "They are. I've read them." He shifted the reader from under his arm, opened it, and scrolled for perhaps 4 seconds. He said, "The Veldrith Compact provisions you're describing fall under the bilateral trade agreement registered with the Union Compact Authority in year 41 of the current cycle. Article 11 of that agreement governs Veldrith Social Compact enforcement within Union-registered territories. Article 14 of the same agreement specifies that no party to the bilateral compact may invoke social erasure provisions against an individual in a manner that prevents that individual's legal personhood from being recognized within the physical jurisdiction of a Union garrison post." He looked up. Sethavarich Waystation is within the garrison's jurisdictional boundary. That boundary is registered on record. He paused. Article 14 also specifies that Union liaison officers have an affirmative obligation to publicly acknowledge any legally recognized individual within that boundary, which is what I was doing. Orvith Sanvale was still. He had the controlled stillness of a man who had not expected resistance and who was recalculating without showing the recalculation. He said, "This is an interpretation that the Veldrith Compact Authority has not yet reviewed." Davin Kale said, "You're welcome to request that review. The Compact Authority's processing time for bilateral agreement interpretations is currently running at about 14 weeks. In the meantime, Article 14 stands as written." He said it without heat, without the edge of a man who wants to win something. He said it the way a man states a documented fact, plainly, with the particular steadiness of someone who read the document before he needed it, and who is therefore not uncertain about what it says. Orvith Sanvale said, "The Veldrith delegation's trade activity through this way station represents a significant portion of the garrison's supply logistics." Davin Kale said, "I know, I have those numbers." He closed the reader. "I'm also aware that Sethavarreach represents the only Union-certified transit route for Veldrith imports into the outer 3 sectors. The garrison's supply logistics matter, so does the transit certification." He looked at the elder in the same even way he looked at everything. "I'm not interested in creating a dispute. I'm interested in doing my job. My job includes acknowledging every legally recognized individual in this market. That's all this is." It was not all this was, and everyone within earshot understood that. But Orvith Sanvale was a man who understood political leverage, and he understood that the leverage he had brought to this moment had encountered an answering leverage, and that pressing the exchange further in a public market in front of trade representatives and garrison personnel would cost him more than withdrawing would. He inclined his head, the Veldrith gesture that means acknowledgement without concession, and he moved the delegation forward. Davin Kale turned back to the display. He said, "Sorry about that. You were telling me yesterday about the second consignment from the agricultural moon. I didn't quite catch which district it came from." I had not been telling him that yesterday. What I had told him yesterday was something else entirely. But I understood what he was doing, which was reasserting the ordinary, and the ordinary was what I needed. And so I told him about the second consignment and the district it came from, and the difference in the pod drying methods between the coastal and inland operations. And my voice was steady, and I kept it that way. And he listened in the way he always listened, and the market moved around us as markets do. He bought 4 pods that day. He paid for them and said, "See you tomorrow," and he went on his way. I stood at the display for another hour after that, working, watching my hands. The delegation departed on the 4th day. I did not speak to any of them. They did not speak to me. Orvith Sanvale walked past the display twice during the delegation's stay, and both times his eyes moved past me in the smooth erasure that the void naming requires, and I performed the task of remaining exactly where I was and continuing to arrange grain pods on a shelf, which is a small act and a sufficient one. Threshvallen said nothing about the exchange in the market. She was not a woman who said things unless they needed to be said. But 2 days after the delegation left, she gave me an afternoon off, which she had not done before, and she said, "The sun is good today. Go outside." It was her way of saying something without using the words she didn't have for it. I took the afternoon. I walked the perimeter of the way station's outer boundary. Sethavarreach was a rough, flat world, reddish soil and shallow scrub, the kind of place that looks stark at noon and turns unexpectedly beautiful in the late afternoon light when the sun angles low and everything goes amber and rose. There is a ridge of dark basalt half a kilometer outside the western gate, and if you sit on the ridge you can see the way station below and the garrison complex and the market roof lines, and the whole thing looks small and impermanent the way frontier settlements always look, like something that has not yet decided whether it will stay. I sat on the ridge for an hour. I tried to locate what I was feeling, which is a practice I had given up for most of the previous 340 days, because the gray stability required a certain suspension of that kind of examination. What I found when I looked was not what I expected. It was not relief exactly, though there was something in the territory of relief. It was not gratitude exactly, though there was something in that direction too. What it was, most precisely, was this. For 8 months I had operated on the working assumption that the void naming had removed me from the category of persons who could expect to be seen by their own kind, and that the void naming was accurate, that it described something real about me, some quality of incompleteness that had always been present, and that the ceremony had simply named. Void naming does this to you. It works over time, not because you believe it consciously, but because it shapes the way you read every interaction, and enough interactions read a particular way will eventually inform you about what you are. What Davin Kale had done in the market was not heroic, in the sense that heroism usually requires a sacrifice, and what he had done was careful and quiet, and had used a clause in a bilateral compact to contain its own cost. I am not diminishing it by saying that. The containing of cost is its own kind of competence, and in any case the cost was not nothing. He was a new liaison officer in a way station where Veldrith trade relations mattered, and he had chosen to invoke a compact provision rather than look past me, and that was a choice, and choices cost something even when they are made well. But it was not the tactical competence that stayed with me on the basalt ridge. It was the moment before the tactic, the moment when Orvith Sonvale stopped walking and Davin Kale, who understood exactly what was coming, did not move from the display and did not adjust his stance, and did not perform a readiness that would acknowledge the confrontation as something to be prepared for. He simply stood where he was, in the same unremarkable posture he always stood in, looking at me in the same way he always looked at me. As though the situation were not different from any other morning. As though the elder's approach changed nothing about the fundamental fact of where Kale was and who he was speaking to. I had been invisible for 8 months. Not invisible the way a person is invisible when no one happens to notice them. Invisible the way a thing is invisible when the architecture of a social system has been organized to produce that effect. And someone had looked at me in that architecture, in front of the people who had built it, and continued to look. And in the continuity of that looking there was something I did not yet have a word for. Threshvallen had a word for it. She told me that evening when I returned from the ridge and she was closing up the annex. She said, in her own language, she spoke compact standard but preferred Ashkevar for important things, a word that I had to ask her to translate. She translated it as something like the one who remained in the path. She said it was what her people called a person who did not move when they should have moved according to everyone who was watching. She said it was usually said with admiration. She said it was sometimes said with exasperation. She said it was always said with accuracy. I thought about that word for several days. There is a Veldrith word that is similar but not identical. I had been thinking about it since the market incident. The word is Orvith Senoth. It has appeared in the formal Veldrith recognition literature for centuries, which I knew because I had studied the literature as part of my bonding preparation, and the studying of it, in retrospect, feels like being taught a language you would need before you knew you would need it. Orvith Senoth translates, approximately, as the one who stood in the place where standing costs something. It is one of the oldest recognition words in the Veldrith lexicon. It is not used casually. It is not used in ordinary social exchange. It is used when a person has done something that demonstrated, by their continued presence in a specific location under specific conditions, something essential about their character. I had never expected to use it. After the void naming, I had assumed the recognition vocabulary of my own culture had been placed beyond my reach in the same way everything else had, that I had been cut off not only from the social infrastructure, but from the language of connection that the infrastructure had been built to carry. I thought about the word. I did not use it. Not yet. I was not ready to use it, and being not ready was information I was learning to respect, because the gray stability, for all its limitations, had taught me that readiness is not something you can accelerate, and that using a word before you are ready to mean it is a way of emptying the word of what it carries. The weeks after the delegation's departure were quiet in the way Sethavar Reach was usually quiet, not empty, but unhurried. The market continued. The garrison continued. Davin Kale continued his morning route. He bought dried pods. He asked about the consignments. He told me, one morning, about a navigational dispute between two transit operators that he had spent 3 days mediating, and the way he described it was dry and methodical, and had a quality of restrained humor that appeared to be native to the man rather than performed, a humor that lived in the precise description of absurdity rather than in anything loud. I told him, in exchange, about the void naming. I had not intended to. It came out over the course of 2 or 3 mornings, incrementally, in the way things come out when you are talking to someone who listens without the expression of patient endurance. I told him about the ceremony and the 3 withdrawals, and the review before Orvith San Vale, and the 72-hour evacuation and Thresh-Valen's supply annex. I did not tell him the specifics of the ceremony, but I told him the structure of it, and what the void naming meant in practice, and what it had been like to watch 11 Veldrith residents perform the precise geometry of inattention every time I appeared in their field of vision. He listened to all of this. He did not say that it was terrible, which would have been true but not helpful. He did not say that the Veldrith were wrong, which would also have been true but which would have misunderstood the more complicated truth, which was that the Veldrith Compact Law had its own internal logic, and that Orvith San Vale had used that logic expertly, and that the problem was not that the law existed, but that a man had used it as a tool for something the law was not designed to address. He said, eventually, "What happened to the bonding house? The Sethvar house?" I told him that the Sethvar house's trade rights had been consolidated into Orvith San Vale's branch operation within 6 months of my void naming. The void naming had served its purpose. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a precise piece of timing." I said that I had noticed the same thing. He said, "Have you filed an Article 7 challenge with the Compact Authority? The bilateral compact has provisions for void naming proceedings that were initiated for purposes of commercial consolidation, rather than genuine incompleteness findings." I told him that I had considered it. I told him that the filing process required a sponsoring Veldrith house that was willing to put its compact standing behind the challenge, and that I did not have a sponsoring house, and that without one the authority would decline to accept the filing. He said, "What if the sponsoring party weren't a Veldrith house?" I looked at him. He said, "The bilateral compact specifies a compact-registered entity in good standing. It doesn't specify Veldrith. The garrison qualifies." I said, "The garrison's involvement would create a diplomatic complication with the Veldrith trade delegation." He said, "Yes, I've thought about that." He looked at his reader. There's a case from Cycle 37 where a Union diplomatic mission served as the sponsoring entity for a challenge to a similar proceeding under a different species social compact. The challenge succeeded. The diplomatic complication was managed through a parallel trade discussion that ran concurrently with the legal process. He paused. "I have a meeting with the Compact Authority's Outer Sector representative in 3 weeks. I could request an initial consultation about filing options." "That's not a commitment, it's a consultation." I said, "Why would you do that?" He looked at me. That full-level look. He said, "Because the Compact Authority exists for exactly this kind of situation, and you appear to have been the victim of a void naming that was manufactured for commercial rather than genuine reasons, and the fact that you haven't filed a challenge because you don't have a sponsoring entity is a gap in the process, not a verdict." I said, "You barely know me." He said, "I know you're good at what you do. You know more about agricultural import logistics than anyone in this market, and a proceeding that was used to strip a trade house of its assets probably shouldn't be allowed to stand just because no one's tested it." He paused. "I'd feel the same way about anyone in this situation." I thought later that this was both true and not quite the whole truth. I think he would have felt the same way about anyone in a similar situation. But the way he said it, the specific, grounded, practical way he said it, with the reader open and the case from Cycle 37 already located, told me that he had been thinking about it before I told him about it, which meant that he had recognized the situation and considered what could be done about it before I had given him the explicit information that made it necessary. That is a different thing from feeling the same way about anyone. That is a man who pays attention. He filed the consultation request 3 weeks later. He told me the morning after he did it. He said that the consultation was scheduled, that the authorities' representative had been interested in the Cycle 37 precedent, and that the process would take time and might not succeed, and that I should know those things so I had accurate expectations. I told him I had accurate expectations. He looked at me. He said, "You've been operating on low expectations for a while." I said that I had. He said those are useful in the short term. They're also sometimes wrong. I thought about this for a long time after that morning. I had been very precise about not allowing expectations to accumulate in the 14 months since the void naming. Precision about this had been protective. If you do not expect anything, then nothing that happens is a disappointment, and you preserve the gray stability. But there is a cost to the precision, which is that it applies uniformly. It does not only prevent disappointment, it prevents the other thing, the thing that you need to live a life rather than merely continuing to exist in one. I had not put a name to what I was giving up when I gave up expecting anything. Standing at the outer display on an unremarkable morning, thinking about what he had said, I began to put a name to it. He came by the display 2 days later and said, "I've been reading the Compact Authorities Precedent Library for related cases. There are 4 filings similar to ours from the outer sectors in the last 30 years. 2 succeeded fully, 1 partially, 1 was declined. The declined one had a procedural defect in how the challenge was framed that I think we can avoid." He had the reader out. He showed me the relevant filings, walking me through the structure of each one. He was methodical about it, not lecturing, but explaining the logic the way a man explains the logic when he wants the other person to understand it fully, not just to know the conclusion. I studied the filings. I found, in the second successful case, a precedent mechanism that his framing had not yet incorporated, a specific subclause in the bilateral compact's personhood provisions that addressed the question of who could be named as an interested party in a void naming challenge. I pointed it out. He looked at it for a moment and said, "That's better than what I had." He wrote a note in the reader's margin. He said, "You should see the authorities' response when we get it. It's your case." It was my case. He had said that as plainly as he said everything, and it was plainly true, and the plain truth of it was itself a form of restoration. Not the restoration of the void naming decree being overturned, but the restoration of being a party to something, of having standing in a matter that concerned me, of my knowledge and attention being relevant to an outcome. I told him that I would want to see the authorities' response. He said, "Good." He closed the reader. "The grain pods from the coastal district, are they still coming in on the same route, or has the shipper changed?" I told him about the route, and the shipper's recent change in transit contracts, and the implication for arrival timing in the next quarter, and we stood at the display in the morning light and worked through the logistics of it, which was pleasant in the same way that useful work is always pleasant, and he went on his way. I stood at the display for a long time after that, not restacking anything, just standing there in the amber morning light, thinking about the subclause I had found and the phrase he had used, "It's your case," thinking about what it meant for something to be yours, after a year of having nothing be yours. There is a particular quality to the late afternoon on Sethavar Reach, when the sun has dropped to the level of the scrub, and the shadow lines are long and the reddish soil turns something closer to copper. I had been watching this quality of light for 8 months, and finding it, in the gray stability, simply a feature of the day. In the weeks after the consultation was filed, I began to notice it differently. Not as a beautiful thing exactly, but as a thing that was happening, as evidence of a world that was still doing what the world does regardless of what is or isn't happening inside a given person. The garrison had a fire circle at the western perimeter, a shallow stone ring about 30 meters outside the garrison wall, used by off-duty personnel for the social function that fire circles have always served, which is the function of not being indoors and being near something warm and not being required to explain yourself. I had walked past it many times. I had not sat at it. I sat at it one evening, 43 days after the delegation's departure. The night was cool and the scrub was dark, and the basalt ridge was a shadow against a sky that had too many stars for a person raised in the home system to entirely expect. 2 garrison personnel were at the fire when I arrived, and they made room in the way people do when they're off-duty and a space is freely available, and I sat down, and no one said anything about my being there, which was itself a kind of statement. Davin Kale arrived half an hour later. He came from the garrison in civilian clothes, no uniform, a plain dark jacket, the reader absent for once. He sat down at the fire circle and he found me there and he said, "Good evening," and I said, "Good evening," and we watched the fire for a while. The other 2 personnel left eventually, quietly, without ceremony. It was that kind of evening. We sat for a while in the silence that is possible between people who have been talking to each other every morning for nearly 2 months, and who have therefore established that silence between them does not mean absence of regard. Then I asked him the question I had been forming for 43 days. I said in the market, when Elder Orvith Sonvale stopped walking, "Why didn't you move?" He looked at the fire. He took a moment, not the moment of a man who is deciding what to say, but the moment of a man who is finding the accurate words for something he has already thought through. He said, "Because moving would have been a statement about who you were." And I hadn't seen any evidence for that statement. I said, "You had known me for 5 weeks." He said, "Long enough to know the statement was wrong." I said, "You risked the garrison's trade relations." He said, "I applied a clause in a bilateral compact that exists for exactly that situation. The risk was manageable." He paused. "It would have been a risk not to." I said, "Most people in your position would have found a reason that the clause didn't apply." He said, "I know." He said it plainly, without any edge of self-congratulation. The way a man states a thing that is simply true and has no investment in what the stating of it makes him look like. I sat with that for a moment. The fire was low. The stars on this world were thicker than I had ever grown accustomed to, and they did their usual work of making the near world feel small and temporary, which is sometimes what you need the stars to do. I said, "There is a word in Veldrith." I said it in Veldrith first, quietly, Orvith Senoth, because a word belongs in its own language before it is translated, and because the speaking of it in my own tongue was itself a thing I had not done in a long time, a reclaiming of a language that the void naming had made me afraid to use. "It means," I said, "the one who stood in the place where standing costs something." He looked at me. I said, "It is one of the oldest recognition words in the Veldrith lexicon. It is used when a person's presence in a specific place under specific conditions has demonstrated something essential about their character. It is not used casually." I paused. "I have not used it before. I was taught it, but it had not applied before." He was quiet. The fire did what fire does. I said, "I am using it now, Orvith Senoth. That is what you are." He looked at the fire for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you." 2 words. He had begun this with 2 words, "Good morning," and he ended it with 2 words, and between those 2 poles there was the whole of what had happened, which I will not attempt to compress into a single description because it resists compression. But the "thank you," he said, was the kind that a man says when he understands the weight of what he has been given, and is not going to diminish it by speaking longer than necessary. He received the word the way he received everything, fully, without performing the receiving. We sat at the fire until it was low coals and the stars were very bright, and the scrub had gone completely to shadow. The compact authority consultation was ongoing. The challenge was not resolved. There were months ahead in which the resolution would either come or not come, and I had built enough honest expectation to know that resolution was not guaranteed. The void naming was still a legal fact. The 11 Veldrith residents of Sethavar Reach still performed their geometry of inattention when I appeared in their field of vision. But I had spoken a Veldrith word that I had not spoken before. I had said it at a fire circle outside a frontier garrison, on a reddish world with too many stars, to a man who had read a bilateral compact clause before he needed it, and who had not moved when a clan elder stopped walking, and who had said, "Good morning," for 43 days before he asked for anything in return, and who had said, "Thank you," in the particular way of a man who understands the exact weight of the thing he is thanking you for. The fire went to coals. Davin Kale said, "Good night, Thessaravil." He said the middle syllable correctly, the way he always said it since the morning I had corrected him, the careful pronunciation of a man who respected the sound. I said, "Good night." I walked back through the waystation gate and through the market, which was closed and dark and smelled of dried grain pods and imported resins, and I went to the supply annex and the cot, and I lay there for a long time looking at the ceiling, which was the cheap composite paneling that most outer rim structures use, scuffed and unremarkable. I was not in the Orvi Sethvan anymore. I had left it somewhere in the previous weeks, gradually, the way you leave a place when you're walking and don't notice the leaving until you turn around and see how far you have come. I did not know yet what I was instead. I was somewhere in the early part of finding out, which is a place that is uncertain and somewhat exhausting and entirely, irreducibly alive. That was enough. For that evening it was enough. I am writing this account 2 years later, in a room that is mine in a more complete sense than the supply annex was, on the second moon of the inner belt, where the compact authority's outer sector office issued a ruling 14 months ago that found that the void naming proceeding against Thessaravil on Sethvar had been conducted with a material conflict of interest on the part of the presiding elder, and that the incompleteness finding was procedurally invalid, and that the void naming decree was null under Bilateral Compact Article 7, subsection 3. The ruling did not restore everything. The Sethvar trade house consolidation had been complete long enough that undoing it would have required a further proceeding that the remaining Sethvar house members chose not to pursue. My name is restored, my legal personhood is restored, the void naming no longer appears in the compact registry. The Sethvar house itself is smaller than it was. The world has moved on in the way worlds do, and not everything moves back. Orvith Sonvale filed a response to the ruling. The compact authority reviewed the response and declined to alter the ruling. I do not know what Orvith Sonvale thinks about this, and I find, when I examine myself on the question, that I am not very interested in what he thinks about it. The gray stability had its uses. It removed a great deal of investment in the opinions of people whose opinions were not worth the weight I had been giving them. Davin Kale is still the liaison officer at Sethavar Reach. His posting rotation was extended at the garrison commander's request. He has told me, in the practical, specific way he discusses these things, that Sethavar Reach has been a good posting. The transit logistics are interesting. The market has a competence to it that you don't find everywhere, and the late afternoon light on the basalt ridge is one of those things that is objectively worth getting up for. I have not gone back to the supply annex. I go back to Seth of our reach. I go back regularly. I go back because Threshvalen still has a display that needs restacking, and because the GrainPod import routes have become genuinely complicated in ways I find interesting to untangle, and because the Compact Authority's ruling created a legal precedent that 2 other parties have already cited in subsequent proceedings, which is the kind of compound outcome that makes filing the right thing in the first place seem, in retrospect, obviously correct. And I go back because there is a fire circle at the western perimeter of the garrison that is visible from the basalt ridge in the late afternoon light, and because on most evenings a man in a dark jacket with no reader sits at that fire circle and watches the scrub go dark as the stars come out, and because when I walk down from the ridge and come through the western gate he turns and says, "Good evening," and I say, "Good evening," and we sit together at the fire for as long as the fire burns. I have not stopped using the word I spoke on the first evening. I say it in Veldrith in the way it should be said, without translation offered, because he knows by now what it means. He receives it the same way he received it the first time, fully, without performing the receiving, with the particular steadiness of a man who understood from the beginning that the weight of it was real, and who has not in 2 years given me any reason to use a lighter word. Orvith Senath, the one who stood in the place where standing costs something. That is what he is. That is what he has been since the morning he did not move when an elder stopped walking. I thought, for a long time after the first evening at the fire, that this was the whole of the word, that it described that single moment, that specific location, that specific cost. I think now that it is not about the single moment. It is about all the mornings before it, when he said good morning and waited for an answer, and all the mornings after it, when he said good morning and waited for an answer, and the consultation request he filed without being asked, and the Article 7 challenge he built out of a bilateral compact clause and a case from Cycle 37, and the precise way he said the middle syllable of my name. It is about a person who remained in a place, consistently, for as long as remaining was the right thing to do. He stayed. That is the whole of it, when you find the shortest accurate description. He stayed, and that, it turns out, is what it takes.